Good morning. How's everybody doing? Yeah? I don't have a verbal joke, so I just put that up. If you're not familiar with XKCD, you'll surely come across it at some point. This is an XKCD comic. I figured this would be something you guys could relate to. Yeah, I have no idea. Like, when it comes to Git, 10 plus years in, don't really want to get into the nitty gritty personally. It is quite a beast, and a lot of developers feel the same. So, nice funny joke about that. And then in typical XKCD fashion, there's always like a tooltip joke as well. How are we feeling about yesterday? I had warned a little bit about closures, that topic itself is quite an advanced topic. How many people here feel like they understand closures? Not bad. That's good. That's good. I won't spend time, just because this is going to be a pretty heavy lecture in terms of like all the things, just like yesterday, that we have to cover. I won't spend too much time at the onset doing a review of yesterday. But what did I say yesterday? A lot of stuff builds, right? And so we will probably touch on things from day before yesterday, which was objects, and then yesterday, which was functions and callbacks. Okay. But today is Friday. So first of all, happy Friday, right? TGIF? Yeah, it does not really apply today. Sorry. In fact, you have a mock test today. So your Fridays are a little bit more, intense in that respect. The mock test is, I believe, in the afternoon, 3 p.m. That's right? Sorry. Okay, there you go. And a lot of what you're going to do today is intentionally going to prepare you a little bit for getting comfortable with being able to deal with that kind of a mock test. Okay. So a little bit of context on the mock test, so I'm not stressing people out. It's called a mock test for a reason, right? There's going to be one next Friday as well. And these tests aren't like make or break, right? These are not like your final or midterm exams or anything like that. And specifically with this one, unlike the one that will be the non-mock test, this one, we encourage you to do it by yourself. But collaboration is, as a last resort, is okay, right? So ideally, you should be able to work on it yourself. And instead of being a traditional like time box test, it is one that can carry into the weekend. So the hope is that you don't just work on the test all day. If you're not fully at 100% completion of it, you actually can take it into the weekend. And it's very common for students to work on it on Saturday/Sunday, with the goal of getting to 100% by the end of the weekend. That's your goal. Because that's what will be expected of you on the real test as well on Friday. These are not the only pieces of assessment that we have, right? So again, they're not make or break. If you don't get to 100%, you get to 80 or something like that on the mock test, but you really understood what you did, I think that's pretty good, rather than somebody that got to 100 but didn't really understand most of what they did, right? And so, of course, here we're not looking for test-driven education, right, where people are just memorizing things for tests. That's not the goal. So you can also, the way we've structured it is as much as possible for self-assessment as well. Like, yes, they're not like you're not building apps yet, but you are solving those small little functions that you're kind of doing this week, right? And so they do help build that kind of software engineering comfort level. But what are we talking about this morning? So here's my agenda. We're going to talk about NPM. You've used NPM a little bit, very little, but you don't have full exposure to it. So we're going to start using it today and onward. And it's going to be a pretty staple in your tool belt, I guess. And so you'll want to get comfortable with NPM. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about modules as well, how to write more modular code, getting more and more real world as we go. It's pretty interesting. And we'll talk about unit testing or testing with Mocha and Chai. So that'll be fun as well. So let's start with NPM. We can actually go to NPM's website, and the super generic tagline is great. But essentially, NPM is a command line. Well, it's a combination of things. There's a command line utility that we have called NPM, right? And it allows us to manage different things that we want to use in our application so that we can get going really fast. Right? The idea is that many different JavaScript or other apps that you build will require things that are common between your other apps that you're building or other developers are building. And so instead of building those things from the ground up, why don't we leverage other libraries, or code rather, that other developers have written that's potentially open source, right? And install them into our application and then start using them. So I'm going to show you how to do that and what that looks like. So we're in a folder here, and I've got nothing in here. And one of the things I'm going to do right off the bat is I'm going to use an npm command to say that I want to actually install other dependencies, other things that I'm going to be dependent on. And so I'm going to initialize this folder that I'm in as an npm folder. Now, if I don't say -y, it's going to ask me a bunch of questions. What's the name of your package? What's the version, description? What's the main file that you're going to have? We don't really need to give it the right answer on any of these things. So I'm just going to hit enter on a bunch of these. And yeah, say that it's OK, essentially. The other option would have been to just say -y, which is essentially blank on all of those things. And what that does is it creates a file right off the bat. Package JS on, which is often pronounced as either JSON or JSON. We won't get into JSON or JSON, which is into too much detail. You'll have a weekend reading on it, and next week and the week after, you'll spend quite a bit of time with that stuff. But I'll give you a quick kind of explanation that this file is a JavaScript file. It's just, it stands for JavaScript object notation. So really, it's just a JavaScript object, as you can see with the curly brackets. Right? And it's just data, right? It's just like a description of what I just filled in that survey. Okay. Not all of this is important, but you saw that, the name, description, and things like that. And eventually, if we want, we can use this information, fill it out even more, because we can edit this file as we want, to be able to publish this particular folder if we think that other developers can use it. But that's not what we're going to do today. We're actually going to consume similar packages like this that other people have initialized and uploaded to npmjs.com. Okay, so we're going to be the consumers in this case, not the publishers. But you could be both, right? So far, so good? So now, if I was to, actually, one NPM that you did use, does anybody remember what, actually, I don't think you installed it. Did you install anything with NPM in the prep course? Yes. No. Yes? Was it not JavaScripting? Yeah, that's what I thought. So you might not remember because it was a quick one, but you installed JavaScripting.
Yeah, the JS fundamentals course.
Yeah, in the JS fundamentals, exactly. So this is an NPM description page for the package JavaScripting. Do you remember JavaScripting from the prep course? Yeah, I think I don't know if I have it installed, but it was like, I guess I have to install it, don't I? This is how I install it, according to their npm install -g or -- global, they're the same thing, and then the name of the package. And NPM does its magic, uses like network connection to go ahead from its servers and downloads that published package, whatever the latest version is. And -G means global, so that I can access it anywhere on my terminal. Remember this? This was installed with NPM. So anytime you want to install JavaScript tools, so you saw this as a tool, right? I ran it from the command line, or like code that you would require and use in your code, either of those you would install with NPM. So if we look at like NPM details here, we can see like, there's the command, although the details tell us to use global. And weekly downloads, some details about what kind of license is it, MIT license, what's the latest version, and is there a homepage or a web page where I can learn more about it. Some of them have their own pages. If it's a really big library like jQuery or something like that, it'll have its own website. In this case, they just take you to the README file on GitHub. Very common. And if we look at this, this code base on GitHub, just like our own, we can actually click on this and tells you the breakdown of what kind of code it is. In this case, it's 100% JavaScript code in this particular repository. And like a good published package or library, it has a license file and a README file and so on. But it also, you'll notice, has that same file that I initialized in my code base, right? Except theirs will be a little bit more detailed and more accurate. It'll actually have a description, have an author, right? And then it has this thing called dependencies. And that's what we're going to also focus on. That's really what we're going to need to build for ourselves. Does anybody know what dependencies would mean? Based on the fact that it's an English word? Can you take a guess? Yep.
Other scripts that it needs in order to function.
Yeah. Other, we'll call them modules. Other modules that this particular package is dependent on. In JavaScript, I believe the word package and module are often used together, even though they're slightly different. So you might see me interchange the words packages and modules. So what that means is I could go ahead and on npm.js, I could go ahead and look up these ones as well. Right, like colors. Okay, what's that about? No idea. I would go maybe GitHub colors. That's not maybe GitHub colors JS. Get colors in your Node.js console. Approximately 4,000 stars, so it seems to be relatively popular. Hasn't really been touched in a while, but we can read the README and get an idea of, there's a screenshot here showing some of the cool things you can do with colors. Maybe you'd want to install it and make your apps a little bit more lively. I don't know. And it is also a package, right? And we could look at its package JSON and see that it's a little bit more detailed. And actually, it has no dependencies as far as I can tell. Right. Going back to the one for JavaScripting, it has one called Workshopper Adventure, which is interesting. So we can look that up. Oh, I already have it in my history. And I love their description. Not an adventure, not a workshopper, it's both, right? Okay. And so as it turns out, it's a flexible terminal workshop runner framework. So this is actually what JavaScripting is using. And maybe other tutorials, maybe there's like a TypeScript, which is another language that you can use. Maybe there's a TypeScript tutorial, and it would be built with this so that they don't have to build the exact same menu and all the logic to do with that and colors and all of those things. They just end up adopting this library, Workshopper Adventure, and then they can get straight to creating the tutorials or the exercises, which is interesting. So it's all about, what's that phrase? Standing on the shoulders of giants, is that the phrase? right? It's basically that's what we're doing as we build up. And so essentially there's this like multi-layer cake, if you will, of goodies to the point where, okay, this is my app sitting here, leveraging all of these things directly or indirectly. Right? So a question from, I'm terrible with names, it'll take me a while. Andrew?
Yeah, just quick. I noticed that you were looking at like the stars and the latest posts on GitHub things. Are there general rules for like what's more reliable than others?
Yeah, there's the question is to do with like stars and looking at last modified date. Are there general kind of practices that you follow? Yeah, if you Google like, or if you npm, like let's say you're like, I need a library that can help me work with dates, right? So you type in dates, and you quickly realize that like, what's the search result here? This is all JavaScript libraries, okay? Quite a bit. And then you'll maybe narrow it down a little bit based on what you want. You know, you don't really want to use React dates because you're not working with React or whatever it may be. But still, you're not really sure which one to pick, and there's just so many. Like one of the problems actually with the npm community / ecosystem is that it's so easy to publish something. Like we could very easily in lecture, maybe not in this lecture, go ahead and publish our library to npm. There's no like, it's not like Apple's App Store where it has to go through an approval process, right? This is all open. They don't have a whole team of approvers here. So anybody can go ahead and publish something, which is why we see so many packages that are often named the same thing or very similar things. And so we want to use tactics like looking at how popular the library is, maybe even going through the source code a little bit once you're comfortable. You know, is it well tested? Is it well maintained? Click on the issues. What kind of, are the bugs being fixed regularly? I'm not going to go into too many details, but those are kind of the high-level metrics that I look at.
Yeah, in my head I was like, I can't decide which one's better, like last modified being like very recently when people acted on it, or better than modified because the code was good as is. It's kind of like a
Yeah, that's a good point. But in certain communities like JavaScript, it ought to be modified regularly because JavaScript changes so quickly. Once it's more stable, I guess, I would expect that to be less. For example, Ruby libraries tend to be a little bit more stable because Ruby hasn't had any major updates recently, right? Yeah, exactly. Otherwise, what it's telling me is that it's probably using an older version of Node and not using new syntax, you know, those kind of things. It may not be that important, but it tells me something. Last modified date, though, also, I definitely know, I've heard of people who will like just go in there and make a few changes to their library, but not really do anything substantial, just so that it looks like it's keeping up to date. But it's not really. They'll make small little tweaks, update the README, documentation, and not really put the effort in. So sometimes you have to dive deeper. So let's actually play around with one of these. Let's try colors. I don't know, I haven't really tried it myself, but we can try it. What was it, colors? GitHub, colors. Okay, so I'm going to follow the instructions here. npm install colors. Cool. npm install colors. Again, I'm using short form, but you could type in install if you like. And now, you'll notice a bunch of stuff has changed in my directory. I already had this file, but now I have a lock file, and more importantly, I have this directory, node modules, which actually my editor's configured not to show, because you don't normally end up looking inside of it. But let's do that. Let's do that for right now. What's inside of node modules? So I have a folder called colors. Right? And it's got a bunch of files, all essentially downloaded from its latest version that you would find on GitHub or wherever it's hosted. Right? So this is downloaded from npm.js. Cool. What does this mean now? Let's actually use this. Let's create a file. I have no idea. Let's call it colorful times. And in here, you know, this is my typical. My O key seems to not be working very well. My typical node file, and apparently I should be able to use that library in here, right? So they'll talk about that. Not too complicated, this one. Var colors equals require colors. And so we'll go with this approach. Var colors equals requires colors safe, because I don't like what I'm seeing here. Okay. And now I've got a variable that is using a require special JavaScript function to reference the code that's in my node modules. Okay, it has to be my node modules for it to work. And now apparently I can say colors.green. I'm going to go with the spelling is throwing me off. Because it's my variable, I get to choose what I want to name it, right? This has to be the right name, because this has to look into the node modules folder and find the right file, right? But the variable is whatever I want to call it. Call it C if I really want to keep it short, right? Ooh, that was easy, right? What's a rainbow? Nice, liking it. So see how quickly we're able to like add functionality to our application without having to write too much code, right? Again, that standing on the shoulder of giants thing. There are even some people actually that like will either as part of their job or their hobby work on these libraries. This is a person that has published this, right? This is not necessarily a company. In some cases, they are companies, but oftentimes they're actually individuals like yourself or myself who work on these open source packages and then using npm publish as a command, publish it onto npm.js, right? And then they tweet about it. They try to maybe put a blog post out there and kind of promote it because they think there's a gap that they're filling with a library that other people can use. And there's the whole conversation of why. Why would they give away code for free, and what's the benefit of that? Why would companies do that? Why is it in their best interest? We won't go into that necessarily. There's a whole lecture we could have on open source software, right? But I'll leave that aside. Yep.
So do you just install that package on that file or on
Yeah, so let me clarify. The question is, where did I just install this thing, right? Colors, is that what you're talking about? So it was installed in my current folder under node modules. Yes, so I have to be within this folders to use it, and npm, and if I look at the other thing I forgot to show you is the package JSON file has changed. This was the important thing here, right? When I install it in this particular package, I've now added that this package is dependent on another package. So I've got my package. Let's call it my, even though it's called like week 1, day 5 or whatever. And then its dependency is colors. Now colors may be a library that has other dependencies as well. In this case it doesn't, but it could be. In fact, there's another library that you will play around with today, right when you finish lecture, and it's called Chalk. And it's, I guess, an alternative to colors. A lot more stars on GitHub, so it seems a lot more of a better alternative to colors. I guess better branding, perhaps, is part of it. And probably better maintained, from what I can tell, right? And I could even look at the releases as a thing to see, like, how often is this released? Version 2.4.2 was released Jan 5th. And this is what it's fixing or implementing. And then mid last year or early last year, there was a release. Not too many, but it still seems to be pretty active. And then, of course, its documentation shows, again, another screenshot. Same idea, though, right? Except what's different about this one, I believe, if I remember, is that it actually has dependencies. If you look here. So it uses 3 other packages in order to achieve its functionality. So in a way that's good, in a way that's bad, right? The other one is completely independent of other things. This one is dependent on these 3 other libraries and specific versions of them, right?
Are those dependencies something based on something he made or somebody else made?
Good question. So dependencies, they could be either. They could be dependencies that they wrote as separate packages because they felt they had very different responsibilities. So here's a package that I think is missing that I need to do. I could put it in here, but I'm going to separate it out because somebody else could use that package. Or they needed it and they actually found it instead of having to write it themselves. So they didn't write it themselves. Oftentimes it's not what you wrote, it's what other people wrote, but not always.
So to actually check the quality of whatever they wrote, you would have to check the quality of those as well because they're referencing them.
Yeah. For example, if there's a bug in supports color, and you're leveraging it, and the function that you're calling has a bug, your library is going to have a bug, right? And so, yeah, absolutely. What a lot of these authors will do is if they find a bug in their library, but they're not the ones that are maintaining, like the bug is actually, they go and they debug a little bit, and they're like, oh, actually the bug is in supports color, right? And they're going to open up an issue. They're going to go into supports color and open up an issue and say, hey, I'm the author of this thing. You know, this is the issue that I'm having. So if I go ahead and you know, GitHub supports color. Looks like this one's actually Chalk, so it's the same organization. So it's probably the same author or the same team at least that's working on it. But there may be open issues, right? Has 16 million is false when terminal supports true color. Seems like it has a bug sometimes, right? Now you are dependent now on hopefully that person fixing that bug, right? That other author. Or you could contribute a fix as well as an open source developer. But they have to, if they own the repository, they have to merge it in. They have to accept it. And so if they're just MIA, you're now kind of like, I guess I'm going to have to use a different library or, and this is getting a little bit advanced, you actually fork this library. And you say, okay, they're not fixing it. I'm going to have my patched version, my fixed version of this supports color that I'm going to use. And so you change your dependencies to not use this particular version of it. You change it to use your fork of it. Right? That's what forking is really all about, or often about, is about, like, okay, I need a slightly different version of this because I have slightly different needs. Right? So if I was to install Chalk, it wouldn't take a lot of effort, right? And now my package.json has Chalk. And now my node modules, let's open those up. I can even go into my node modules folder and open that up. And you'll notice that it doesn't have just 2 libraries, because all I've done is install 2 things. I've installed Chalk, and before that I installed colors. But you'll notice that it has supports color. It has that other one. The others that we basically saw in there. So there's this whole dependency chain, right? And everything that is needed needs to be installed in my subfolder here for it to be used. Because what's going to happen is when I require something in Chalk, there's another file in there that's going to require something in supports color. And so they're going to be requiring each other, you know, so that they can actually work, right? If I try to require something that does not exist, right, then Node is not so happy about that. It doesn't let that proceed. It tries to look for the file and fails because it can't find the file on local node modules folder. Holy crap. That came close. That went fast. Right? Because it couldn't find the module. Okay. So far, so good? Right? And one of the things you probably ought to be doing when you're using something like this is like being curious about, well, what is actually happening here? Like, what is colors? Or let's just call it C, right? What is that thing that I'm using? I mean, you could probably deduce what it is, right? Dot notation. What is this used on? What is the left side if I see a dot? An object, exactly. And so what I expect to see is some kind of an object. What did I do wrong here? Oh, I'm in the wrong folder. Right, an object. And the object actually has some functions, right? Because we said dot green, for example. So I guess that would be a function on here. Or dot rainbow, right? Sometimes these functions tell us, sometimes when we console log you get good insight, sometimes it's not very useful. They are actually terminal codes for colors. Yeah. I guess they would probably be hex, but I'm not sure. I don't think they're actually Unicodes. Yeah. So far, so good? Now, actually, yep.
So you said if you wanted to fix a bug in a module when you download it, you would have to fork it.
Mm-hmm.
What's stopping you from just going into that module right now and without forking?
Okay, so that's a really good question as well. So we're talking about NPM and kind of GitHub workflow in terms of contributing to open source, right, or publishing. So essentially, what do we know about GitHub repos? They are owned by an individual, and that individual they can add other collaborators with read and or write access. Okay, you haven't done this yet because you haven't really worked on your midterm project yet, but you'll do that when you get to a group project and you have to work on the same repo together. Right now it's just individual repos for yourself, right? And so nobody can really go ahead and write to your repo that you've published even as part of Lighthouse, right? You've got some public repos, I believe, on your GitHub profile if you go check your GitHub profile. And so if you go check, another student can't just, Tim, can't just go in and make changes, right?
So he can't make changes to my repo, or he can't make changes to the file?
He cannot make changes to anything in your GitHub repo that you have.
Okay, so locally I can change the modules, but I wouldn't be able to push them.
Yeah, so this is your project, right? This package.json is yours. Yeah. So you're saying which other packages am I including in this particular one? And so you could, I see your question. In your node modules, you could be so brave as to go and open that file and edit it. Okay. But that would be considered bad practice. Sure. You should not go in and edit anything in node modules. You should get it from the canonical, like the main source. And hopefully it's been patched. Whatever thing you're trying to fix has been patched there. If it's not, then what you do is you'd actually fix it on the server and then change your link to actually download your version. The reason for that is the node modules folder is not shared. It's not checked in. It's get ignored. So it'll be basically blown away. It's basically a temporary thing, but you're not going to check it into your repo, usually. So I understood your question afterwards. Sorry. So just to confirm, you are not expected, nor should you, it's considered bad practice to go into your node modules folder and make changes, even though that would work. You would be able to fix bugs or add new features to those libraries. It would be temporarily done, and you would lose those changes if you were to ever delete this directory, because node modules folder is get ignored by default. I mean, it should be get ignored. You could choose not to, but that's the convention. Okay. Now, putting NPM aside for a sec, we'll come back to it. We're talking about modules a lot. We're using the word modules. What the hell does that mean? Right? So we're actually going to start using modules. So we get comfortable with what does that mean. And modules don't necessarily mean you're publishing something. Modules are often used to just modularize your code, to break it up into smaller chunks of files. So far what we've done is, every time we've worked on a project, an assignment, It's always been like what, one file, right? That's kind of limiting, isn't it? So let's actually look towards fixing that. That's where modules come in. So if I have a file, what is it going to be called? Let's just call it index.js for now. Right? And it defines a function. Actually, let's go with the better. So I've got a person, right? Maybe I've got a library of people or something like that. And there's some information. Maybe even there's a function on this, right? A method, from what you may remember from Wednesday. Yeah. So it could be like, a function called full name, something like that, and it would return maybe first name plus last name, something like that. It like combines this two, right? But in order to actually do that, it needs to use this, right? Since it's operating on itself, right? This seemed like a good, quick review of what you kind of did with music library, right? Now imagine I want to like keep my person information separate, and my app is actually, dealing with people, right? I could just keep adding to this one file, but I'd like to separate things out, just like we like to separate out code into separate functions. I don't want a giant file, just like I don't want a giant function. It's going to be hard to manage. It's going to be hard to maintain, hard to like reason about, right? We're going to get confused very easily. So what if my index.js wants to actually use that file, that code? Right? You're required is what you're thinking, and you're on to something, right? So I would go ahead and I would actually be like, okay, well, if I just try to, what is it called in that file? KV. If I just try to do console.log, KV, we're going to, not KV as a string, like that, we're going to notice this is not going to work, right? So I'm going to node index.js, which is trying to access KV. KV is not defined, right? So the scope of this file is really this file. It can't just go ahead and automatically read the other file, right? Even if it's in the same folder. So, name again? Catalina? Am I saying it right? Karina? Okay, sorry. You're saying just require the file, right? So maybe I would do something like var kv equals require, what's the file called? Person? I think it's called person. Person.js. But we don't have to say .js, okay? It's implied because everything you're going to require is going to be JS, right? No. But let's just put it in anyway. It doesn't hurt. Okay. This will not work either. The error we're going to get is, hey, I'm trying to look for this in your node modules folder. There is no library that you've installed in your dependencies called person.js. So it's still looking in my node modules folder. That's not what I want, because it's not something I've installed. It's something that's in my project, and I'm going to have hundreds of these files, and I want to be able to use them, right? And they're not going to be node modules. Node modules is separate things I've installed, not things that I've written, right? Not things that are part of the scope of this project. They're dependencies. So I need to be able to require things that are in my own folders. Like I may have a subfolder called something else, like persons. And then I may have KV and a bunch of other people in there, right? I might want to be able to say persons/KV or something like that. And so I have to be able to control where it's looking for the file. Right now it's by default looking in node modules. Question or comment? Exactly. So we have to specify the path, right? Just like we do when we cd into a folder, right? We can cd into the current folder, or the current folder node modules, right? Or dot dot would mean go back up one folder and then look for something, right? So we're going to actually say specifically, if I don't specify a path, it's going to look into node modules. If I specify this, it's going to look in the current folder / person.js. Okay, and when I run this, and we're console logging this, let's see what actually happens. What the hell? It's not what I expected. What I expected was, when I console log kv, what would I expect it to get back? The object, right? But when I console log, I get back just an empty object. Is that right? So confused, right? What happens, inquiring minds, right? What happens if I just have an empty file? Same deal. So I always just seem to get back an object by default. So it seems like I'm not, this code here, its existence makes no difference to what's happening. To fix this, as you may be wondering, like, what do I do now? Of course, you'd Google it and you'd find that actually, in order to make this, anything in this file available to the other file, in JavaScript, every language is different. In JavaScript, you have to explicitly export it. You have to say, I want to export this object. Okay? And the way you're going to do that is by using something that's available called module. It's just a keyword that you have available as a variable that you haven't defined. It's just available. Okay? So if I, just to show you, if I console log, sorry, not console log, if I node the person.js, indeed, there's an object called module. And specifically what we're going to look at is using its exports. Notice that that's an object. If I don't export anything, by default, it exports an empty object. But I'm going to say, actually, module.exports is no longer going to be an empty object. I want it to be the object that I've defined above, kv. Now, of course, I could just go ahead and define it in line here, right? Like this. And now we're exporting an object with just a key A with a value 1, right? And we're not doing anything with kv. Kv is not getting exported. It is not available to other files to import or require. So if we did it this way as an experiment, what do I expect to find in index.js? I expect to get an object that has A:1. So we're going to run index, which is going to require that object, and we see that we have access to that object now. Now, of course, this is not the object we want, but I was just using that for demonstration. The object we want from person.js is the person that was defined, right? And when we run index now, when it goes and loads that file, requires that file, it's able to get back that object. Okay. So what we have is, just to illustrate, we have our index module that is requiring person.js module, right? And inside of there, we've decided what we want to export. We don't have to export everything that's in here, right? And this particular file decides to export. So I guess we'll write down what it's exporting in here. It's exporting kv, which is really just an object with a bunch of information in it. Locally, it's called kv here as a variable, okay? But what's important is that this object is what's getting required. And then here, we decide to call it whatever we want. We don't have to call it kv there, right? So to illustrate this point here, we'll just call this variable person and export person. And in index, it has its own scope, its own variable names. And when we hit require here, we're getting back the object, right? And so we're really just saying var kv equals that object that's defined in the other file. And here in this file, we call it kv. Are you guys with me? Look how excited you guys look. You finally learned two keywords, module.exports and require, that will now allow you to do something you weren't able to do, which is link files. Exactly. Split your code up into multiple files. I see a couple hands go up. I think yours was first, or did I already? Yeah.
So, for example, if you have more than one object export in like person.js, how would you specify which object you want to get back?
If you have more than one object that you're exporting, great question. Let's say I want to export an object and a function and another object. But you're only really, when you notice, exports an object, right? Or whatever you give it, really, here. Right? For example, what if I export not person, but I export a function? Remember anonymous functions? They can be assigned to variables, right? This is kind of a variable, isn't it? It's a key on an object. So I can do module.exports equals anonymous function, right? I could choose to give that function a name, right? But anonymous will work, right? And in this case, I'm exporting a function. Let's confirm that. So if I console log kv here, what do I expect it will output? Function. And it will say that the function has no name, I guess. So it doesn't really provide the name of the function. And now I could use that function by calling it, right? So you don't have to export an object. You can export a function. But that doesn't answer your question yet, does it? Because you want to do multiple things. But I'm getting there, right? And so we can see that we can use that function now, right? So now you're able to export objects and you're able to export functions. And the question from, your name? Chris is, but how do I export like multiple objects or multiple functions or a combination of those? Anybody want to guess how that's done? There's no additional mechanics to do it. So you have what you have. How would you do it? You don't have any other tricks.
Give additional things keys in the reference file. Like call it the kv dot whatever you call it.
So terrible with names today. Julian is saying, well, I mean, if you can export an object is a collection of things that have names, key value, right? And similar to what we saw with colors, where I got a whole bunch of functions, .green, .rainbow, they were exported in an object, right? And so you can have a master level object that just has your sub-objects, sub-functions, so on. Because what's nice is an object is a collection. And so you can put an infinite number of other objects or arrays or whatever you want in there, or behavior, right? Functions. And we saw that, just to confirm, we saw that with colors, right? Because I outputted this, didn't I? So node colorful, whoops. You can see like they output an object, but the object has sub-objects, other sub-objects that have arrays, and then more importantly, the stuff we need, which is other functions that we're going to use. So that's the way you do it. You still are stuck with one object that you can export, and you're going to put things inside that object. Exactly. Because all you really get to do with objects, for the most part, is properties, right? Keys. And so you can attach as much other data you want or behavior you want to that object. In my case, I am exporting a person, but really the person has two pieces of data and one behavior, one method. And so we can go further and further into that. So it's 9:56. I know we started like what, 6 minutes into 9. So it's been 50 minutes. Let's take a break. And then after the break, we're gonna learn we're gonna take what we've learned with NPM and with modules, and we're now gonna talk about the third thing, which is testing. How we're gonna test our actual code. Okay? So I was just writing notes, right, based on what we've just covered as a recap. But feel free to take your own notes. I encourage you to do that, especially with the digressions that I have. So just a quick recap before we go into testing. We learned that we discovered that every file has access to this keyword called module, right? And on that module, it seems that there's an exports property that is essentially an empty object. When we tried to require our person.js that had the KV object, it couldn't find it, right? And then we realized that we need to specify ./person. Right? But when we did that, we only got back an empty object, not what we expected. We realized that we actually have to use module exports to set it to be whatever we want back in the other file. Right? So we did that, and now our index.js is able to access the exported object from person.js. Right? So what that means, actually, now this is going a little bit off my plan, but from my understanding, then, if I am requiring in my colorful times, if I'm requiring colors/safe, that means in my node modules there's a folder called colors, which we did see that it was there when we used the tree command, and in that should be a file called safe.js, right? Because that's what we're doing. It's a /, right? Let's take a look if that's true. Colors safe.js, right? Now, it's a bit dangerous opening up that file, but let's do it anyway. Let's just open up that whole folder in Sublime or whatever editor you want. And indeed, there's a safe.js. And notice what it does. Uses module.exports. Right? Now they've opted to use a square brackets with a string. Same idea though, same syntax, right? Or same outcome, just slightly different syntax. And so there's no magic here, right? Like basically how we are able to export our person.js is how they're able to export their colors object that we were able to console log and use. So don't, what we've kind of exposed here is behind the curtains how these different packages that we install, and we'll be installing a lot as we progress through the bootcamp, right? We'll be using things like React. We'll be using things like Express next week. All of these are NPM modules that are exported in exactly the same way. Pretty cool, right? It's kind of empowering you to be able to open up a GitHub repo that's NPM, that's a JavaScript-based node package, and actually like go through the source code and start to understand more and more of it, right? How it's actually working. It's pretty cool. So let's put that aside. So we've got our person index, our person.js, and I'd like to be able to like start testing my code, right? I'd like to be able to like make sure that the code is behaving as expected. And sure enough, like one of the things I can do is just write my test code in here, like we've been doing. We've seen stuff like this in our gists and our assignments so far, right? Test code below. Right? But now that we know how to separate files, shouldn't our test code, which has completely different responsibility than our actual business logic, like our actual code, shouldn't they reside in different files? Feels like intuitive, right? Feels logical, right? You're saying yeah? You said yeah, but then you doubted yourself.
I think so.
Yes. Yeah, you're right. They should. So instead of just putting test code below, why don't we just put test code in another file? Right? So I mean, I'm kind of doing that, right? Like I'm exporting. What was I exporting? Not this, but the actual object. And in doing so, I'm able to require it here. Now this JS, by the way, is not required. Right? I'm able to require it here so that I can access that object. And in here, I can have my test code. Right? So that if I ever wanted to just require a person and actually use person, I'm not also requiring the test code. Right? not running that code. Because I'll tell you, if I had test code below and then I'm console logging, right? I don't know, I'm testing full name, right? So I'm doing something like console log full name should be, and then I have whatever, right? KV, and then I say person dot full name in the person file. When this file gets required, what actually happens is it runs this code, right? In order to actually export this code, it has to run it, doesn't it? And it doesn't just say, oh, exports is person. Let me just skip to line 15. It runs the whole code. And so in doing so, it's going to run my test code every time I require a person. Not ideal. Because when I'm requiring person, I just want to use that particular library, right? And so this is kind of the explanation as to why you'd want to split your test code outside of your actual, the library itself, right? Do we agree? Right, just to demonstrate what I'm talking about, in this file that I'm trying to use person in, I have no console logs or anything, just requiring it so that I can start using that object. And when I run it, whoops, I clearly have a typo there. I don't know what I was writing. Need to be concatenating strings, right? And then actually calling the function would be nice, instead of just referencing the function, right? So you can see, like, it ran this console log statement that was my test code below in the same person.js file. Not ideal. I want to be able to take this, move it out into my test file. And in here, I'm calling this thing kv, so it'll be kv.fullname. Agreed? And now, it's still doing the same thing because my index.js is the one console logging this, right? So now the question is, how do we want to actually test this? What techniques have we employed so far to make sure that our functions that we've created are actually working as advertised, as expected, as desired? What are we doing? So far you've been unit testing? Not really. You've just been doing printing. Yeah, and you kind of have to go like, what's the output? You got to read the output to make sure that it's good. Right? Yeah. You just have a bunch of console log statements, right? So you'd have something like this, like maybe something like, if you're being kind of, one way is like actually reading this, which is hard because you have to be like, oh, the output should be, and then you kind of read it, and you have to do cognitive like work to actually make sure that it's working, right? Wouldn't it be nice if it was just like, yeah, this is working as expected or not, like pass or fail, like actually have checks. I mean, maybe I could just use what was it, or chalk, chaff. We'll just use colors are safe, I think it was, right? And we could say like, if kv.fullname equals the expected value, then console.log colors.green. Right? Something like that. So that it's a little bit less cognitive load for the person who's running that code, the test code, to be like, is this working or not? They're just looking for They don't have to go read the entire output to be like, is this matching? It says true equals equals, you know, like, what's happening here? It's a bit easier. Let's see if that works. Let's see I got that right. Success. Now if for some reason person had a bug, was doing 2 spaces, fail. This is all this is doing is being more clever about what I'm outputting. Nothing more. Agreed? Like instead of outputting that it should be Kurum space Varani, I'm just saying if it is equal, equal, equal that, then just show a green thing. Right? Like, I mean, I didn't even have to use colors. I could just literally console log. Like, what is the thing for an emoji? Here we go. Like, you can literally output, you know, and then here for this one, I don't know, something red. Right? At least on a Mac, it's Command Option Space. Nope, that's not what it is. Command Control Space. Yeah, Command Control Space. No, wait. Is that emojis? Yeah. Yeah. Now everybody's going to start using emojis in their console log statements? Is that what's going to happen?
If this was like a database of names, would you'd run like the test like dynamically through like the first, let's say the first name and last name?
Yeah, if this was like
Because if you're just checking one name, that'd be like
yeah, that's a fair point. Like, yeah, exactly. But we're going to actually go further with this and actually like modify it a little bit and actually go write a more mature test. That's my next step. So far, you're with me though? That all we've really done is changed our strategy to use colors to make our life easier and change the output a little bit to make our life easier, right? And nothing more there. I don't even really need to use colors library. I could use emojis. The truth is though that like software ends up being really, really complicated. Hundreds of functions, hundreds of modules, right? And so your test suite and code is quite vast. Some people say that like for every line of code that you have that's like your logic, you have at least 3 to 5 lines of test code. So there's a lot of test code, right? And already I'm having to write, that's a lot of code that I just wrote to test. I think it's more code than the full name method itself, right? So can we make this a little bit more manageable? Not so much fewer lines of code, maybe even more lines of code, but just more manageable, more editable, and actually being able to test different scenarios. Like you just pointed out, right? Like there's just one scenario being tested out here. What about testing different scenarios? And yeah, I could just honestly not do anything more than just this and just keep adding this kind of code with if-else statements everywhere. Or I could use a module to help me write my tests better. And that's where Mocha and Chai come in. Okay, so I'm going to now show you how to do this with Mocha and Chai. Ready? Excited? Nice. So we're not going to write our test this way. Okay? We're not going to need colors because Mocha will use colors right off the bat by itself. And what we're going to do is we're going to install Mocha. And we're going to hit, I don't think you did, I forget which version of NPM you have. If you have an older version, you have to say -test save. Actually, yeah, you have to say save dev. And so I'm going to explain what this is in a second. Because we haven't really looked at save dev, have we? And then we're going to do the same thing with Chai. And again, these are being installed in my current folder's node modules folder. Okay, so I now have a lot more stuff in here. A lot more stuff. This is why you don't want to be checking this into your repo. It's going to just go huge. And we'll see Mocha in here. Right, and the same thing with Chai. And because it's there, we're able to require it, although we're not going to necessarily require it. So, okay, so save dev, first of all, what the hell is that? So if I look at my package JSON, it didn't add Mocha or Chai to my dependencies. It added them to my dev dependencies. So the idea here, these are tools that are helping me do things in my dev environment when I'm using this particular module. They're not things that are needed for this actual app to work. Because person, the business logic, doesn't need Mocha or Chai. Specifically, I'm using Mocha or Chai to test person. And so when I deploy this if I ever deploy this module somewhere, right, it's not going to consider Mocha or Chai a dependency. Because those are just utilities we're using to test our code. Similar to maybe colors, if we were using colors just for testing. We would install it into our dev dependencies, not into our actual dependencies. But they're still going to be in the node modules folder. So now what we're able to do is we're able to require, let's start with Chai. Let's actually bring up Chai's webpage. Chai is a assertion library for Node and the browser, and you can use it with any testing framework. And they show you that there's 3 ways of using Chai. You can say chai.should, which is not usually preferred. You can say chai expect, and so you would say something like expect foo, whatever that variable is, to be a string or to equal this value. Right? So you have these like additional syntax that you need to kind of learn and get familiar with. But what's nice about it is that it reads like English. Some people like that. People like myself couldn't care less about it looking like English because, I mean, does it really need to? And sort of the simplest is assert. So we'll just go with the simplest for now. But eventually you might want to get comfortable with the more popular expect syntax. Okay. So assert is what we're going to use. We're going to use that particular syntax to say assert that these 2 things are equal by calling .equal as a function and giving it those 2 things. Right? So instead of doing our own console log, we're going to rely on this to do a colored console log. Maybe. We'll see if it's colored or not. So what does that look like? I'm going to type something like assert, or no, yeah. Assert, because I've already accessed assert like that. I'm going to say, kv.firstname is Kurum. Or rather, maybe I'll do full name returns. I'm sorry, it's not equals, it's 2 parameters. Right? First parameter and second parameter. Let's see what that does. So this is index.js. It's my test file. I'm going to go ahead and run that. Literally nothing happened. What the hell? What happens if I expected the words to be joined? So it's not actually going to match the left and the right. Okay, that is not what I expected. Am I running the right file? Oh, sorry. Assert.equal is what we're supposed to be calling, right? Let's go back for a second. Assert.equal. So I totally forgot that. And so let's go back to the correct comparison. Oh, so in this case, it's actually not equal because we're getting back two spaces. I forgot that I had made that change, right? So we're getting an assertion error, a pretty big, like, loud message saying, like, hey, something's not working right. I expected this to actually equal this. But no colors, No, like, nice syntax, but definitely an error. Let's see if we fix this error, what happens. So we expected just 1 space between them. Let's go back into our person and make it 1 space. Now they're actually going to match, and nothing comes out. So the convention here is different. It's not we're expecting to see stuff. We're expecting to just see all good, like no actual output. But that doesn't really help us too much, right? Like, it's like, well, did it work? Did it just not run? you know. The other thing interesting about assert, so we'll fix that. The other thing interesting about assert is, of course, you're going to have multiple assertions. For example, you'll say, I want to also make sure that, you know, first name is Karam here. And I want to make sure last name is Varani here, right? But once it fails at this level, it's not going to run these two. But this one's not going to fail any of them. So let's make this one fail again. 2 spaces. And it didn't run the others. I mean, we can't really tell because there's no output, regardless. But it just basically stops here with an error, throws an error. So I can't continue. But to be honest, I like my colored syntax better. Didn't you? Wasn't that better? And so this is where Mocha comes in. Mocha is a test runner. So while chai is your assertion library to just make sure the things are equal, so what they, what is your actual expectation, right? You're actually comparing values. What is the length of foo? Are these things equal? Is this thing a type of that? There's assert dot is true and stuff like that. Assert, full assert API. Assert dot is okay. Assert dot is not okay. There's a lot of these that you can get familiar with, but I don't expect you to go ahead and read all of these. But expect, assert dot is false, right? And so on. So that's our comparison, value comparison thing. Mocha is what's going to add a little bit more management to all of this. It's going to kind of be the thing that you could use chai if you want, you could use something else, but it's going to be able to run these assertions in a nice organized fashion. Okay, so let's actually bring in Mocha into this. So the way to bring in Mocha is actually you're actually going to run it. Let me just show you. Let me comment this out for a second. Comment it out. Sure. I'm not going to require Mocha like I normally require chai because I'm actually going to use Mocha's script to run a file. Instead of using node index, I'm actually going to use Mocha. But the problem is it's installed in like my node modules folder because that's where I've downloaded it. It's kind of really annoying to type this in, don't you think? But let's run it anyway with that. Oh, that's nice. It actually is not only giving me like pass and fail, but it's actually telling me how many tests passed and how long it took to run my tests. Right? So by default, with a pretty much empty file, it's like, yeah, cool, that's a valid Mocha file. Right? JavaScript file that is run with a Mocha runner. And what we're going to do is we're going to maybe put some things in here. Now that didn't really work well. I expected it to like say something in red, right? It's not really doing that. It's doing the same thing it was doing before. It just throws an exception, throws an error. So as it turns out, you don't actually put your code directly in it like this. You actually start organizing with Mocha. It doesn't just give you the nice green and red, because honestly, that's not that much value. It gives you more than that. It gives you management of your tests. So you actually end up writing some code that looks like this. You're going to describe what you're testing. I'm describing that I'm testing person, right? Person.js or something like that. And in here, guess what the second argument is? What does that look like? What is the second argument that I'm passing to describe as a function? Anonymous callback function declared inline, right? I'm not giving it to a variable. It's right there. It's anonymous and it's inline callback function, right? You don't have to use all those words when you're talking amongst yourselves, but just to be deliberate in terms of what we're seeing here, right? And in here, we're saying, okay, all of the things that you're going to find in here are going to be tests against the person thing. Now, you don't have to say person.js here. You can say whatever you like, right? It's describing it. It's just a string. And then in here, we're going to actually write a test case using it. It's another function that's available only if we run the file with Mocha. Because remember, for these things to actually work, they need to be variables, right? But notice that they're not, and they're still going to work. The reason is because Mocha, when we run it with Mocha instead of Node, it injects these functions so that we can use them. Okay? So it adds this so that we can actually call these. So I would actually say maybe what I should be describing is person dot full name. Maybe that's all I'm testing right now. This is my test. And in here I should say it should return the first and last name. The default first and last name. And again, in here I'm going to put the actual test code as a function. So yeah, I mentioned to you yesterday, right? We're going to see a lot of callback functions in Node. We're already starting to see that with Mocha. I'm going to zoom out a little bit so that this is more, we can see kind of what that, let's just shorten this up a little bit. Returns the default first and last name. Yeah. There we go. Close. And so in here, I'm actually going to put my assert. Okay. I've got assert coming in from Chai. It's in my callback function for an it, which is inside of a describe. This is just convention for Mocha that you ought to get used to. Let's actually bring up Mocha's website. I forgot to do that. It's a test framework that runs in Node and in the browser, if you want. Sure, making async. We're not even doing async testing. We're just doing regular testing. Lots of sponsors, lots of users, so on. And there's lots of documentation as well. It's telling you can install it globally, like we did with JavaScripting, or we can install it the way we did, which is into our Node modules folder. Now the thing is, in order to run it, and they talk about, go ahead and describe, and then go ahead and use it, and then you can use your assert, right? And then this is what it will look like. So let's just get that working first, and then we'll improve our process a little bit. So we've got person returns the default first and last name, and then we compare that that is indeed true, and person does indeed respond with return first and last name, right? So let's go ahead and run that. It gives us a nice breakdown of what it's testing and green or red output for each of those tests. So we're actually able to create and manage multiple assertions, multiple tests, and organize them into different its, right? It returns the given first and last names. So here I'm going to say kv.firstName equals k, kv.lastName equals v, and now I expect back not Kuram Birani, because if I ran this, I'm going to get that test failing. And it's going to say, one was passing, one of your tests passed, one of them failed. And returns the given first and last names, failed. I expected KV to equal Kuram Birani. Right? And so it gives us a nice kind of what was the expectation versus what was the actual. Pretty cool, right? But I didn't want to just, I could have just started this lecture being like, hey, there's a thing called Mocha and Chai, and let's go ahead and use these. But as I mentioned to you yesterday, I really want to focus on why and how, right? Why does this thing exist? Oh, we saw that we could just use Chai, or we could just even just not use any of those things and just use red and green ourselves. But then we have a whole bunch of tests. How are we going to manage them? Right? How are we going to nicely output when we have hundreds of these running? Right? It does a nice little output where it specifically tells us what it's testing and what passed and what didn't. So we could have now multiple files that contain these describes. Right? And each of these is a test case. Right? So this is one test, and this is second test. Pretty cool, right? So now what you're armed with is not only the ability to share code between files, for example, exporting person, using it in index, but also you're able to require external modules using colors, using things like Mocha and Chai, installing them using npm, right? So not only your own local modules using the local path to require them, but also if you don't give it a path, you're requiring things out of your installed modules. And one of the ones you're going to use right off the bat today is a testing module, right? Mocha and Chai. And actually, whenever you have a file that has some functions or objects, you're going to export them, and in your other file, you're going to write code that tests them. So we had one thing that we didn't like. This thing that we're running is like so much to like, it's too much. I should just have a shortcut for this. And indeed, if you have a problem like that that you think is a common problem, guess what? It is solved. You can, in your own package.json, you can say that when I say test with npm, I want it to run that file. I want it to run this particular command. So it's an alias for that command. Right? And you can create other scripts as well if you want. And this is writing bash as though you would be writing in your terminal. So this is another language in and of itself. You don't have to master it as part of bootcamp. I'm not comfortable with it myself. But some people that work a lot with like Linux systems are very comfortable with this language and can do quite advanced things, right? But in this case, usually we're not putting too many advanced things in here. And usually it's like scripts that are like test and run. Those are the common ones, right? So let's just see this in action. Now instead of doing this, I'm going to do npm test. Now the thing with test is, by default, if you just run the Mocha thing, the Mocha command, like here, and you don't give it the file name, it actually doesn't assume that the file it's going to run is index.js. What is it looking for? It's actually looking for a folder called test. That makes sense. Like, why would you put your test code inside of like some other place? Why not just put it in a folder called test? Right? And so I'm going to move my index to test, and I'm going to call it something like person test.js. So it's very deliberate what I'm testing. Testing the person file. And now it's no longer index.js. I'm going to close that, don't save. And now it's a subfolder in here. It doesn't have to be, but this is the convention that Mocha suggests that you use. You can override this, but this is what most projects will have. So let's see if that ends up working. npm test. Problem. As soon as I moved it, it seems that it cannot find module./person. Yeah, it's not in the same folder anymore. Right, right. So my person is still in the root folder outside, and person test is inside a folder. We need to go up a directory and then require person. So that's the only sort of change we had to make to that file, hopefully. And the rest should be good. Because this is the relative path from the current file that I'm in, right? So person test is now one directory in. We need to go one directory out in order to access person. Sorry? We already had the person file. We didn't move the person file. We created a folder and moved person test, so it's no longer in the same folder. It's one subfolder in. And in order to run this, we need to come, when we're requiring person, we need to step out one directory and then be able to access person. Yeah, that's the other nice thing with Mocha. I didn't clarify. If I had multiple files that were exporting their information, which most projects have lots of files, I don't need to have, it's nice that I can separate my tests and my code, right? But it would still suck if all my code is in one file and all my tests are in one file and it's just thousands of lines per file. Instead, we have modules. So we're going to split our code up into multiple files, like person, I don't know, school, whatever the things that I'm building are, right? And then it would still suck. Okay, great that I've separated all the logic out into separate files, but it would still suck if I had to like have one test file to test all of those things. It would just be one giant Mocha file. Right? No. Instead, let's have a one-to-one for each of these. I mean, that's just a convention, right? We can have 3 test files for one logic file, but usually it's 1 for 1. Right. I wonder if any of the libraries we looked at, what did we look at? We looked at Chalk, right? Let's take a look at Chalk's code. Notice what you find here. Let's take a look at their package JSON. What are their dev dependencies? Do they use Chai? Matcha. Maybe a different library for doing tests. Let's open up their test folder. I mean, let's be brave here, right? What's the worst? We won't understand some of the code that we see, but let's just see what's in there. I don't know. I haven't opened this up before. Let's open up Chalk. So they use slightly different. This is a more modern way of using require, but it's not actually available in Node yet. It'll probably be another year before this actually becomes available. But there's polyfill. Yeah, I'm not going to go into it. But anyway, this is a require statement. Look at that. There's a test, but instead of saying it or describe, they've got a different syntax because they're not using Mocha or Chai. They're using a slightly different library. There are, I don't know about hundreds, but there's tens of different popular testing libraries. So it's a matter of which one you're going to pick. We just happen to pick Mocha and Chai. It is that combination is probably one of the most popular combinations. It's not the only, right? Another one that I can think of is tape. Don't just type in tape. That's not going to give you the results that you need. That looks a lot similar to what they have, right? T.equal, similar to our assert.equal, right? Slightly different. Slightly different output, but same kind of idea, right? It runs our tests, tells us how many failed, and how many didn't, and why. And then instead of using Mocha, they're using tape. Right. I don't think Colors had any tests, which was kind of sad to see. Did they? No, they did. Tests. They call their folder tests. And their naming convention is slightly different. They say file space or dash test.js. They don't seem to have any kind of organization to their tests. They've gone very like bare bones. They don't have any dependencies. Right? You could still do it. We saw that we could do it. It would just be a little bit harder to read. But everybody has a different opinion on this, right? If it's a small library, maybe I'm not going to bother with Mocha Chai. I'm just going to use like built-in assert and not do anything fancy. Really depends. And it's a personal preference thing as well. Sorry, you were saying?
So it seems like the only difference really is like the front end of what you're seeing, like how they output the information.
So the question is, like, it seems like the only difference between something like tape or whatever they were using, what were they using? I forget. Or Mocha Chai, is the output difference, the syntax. Actually, it's the output, so the way it actually outputs. There's a bunch of features. You could even give it flags to say, I want it to output like this. Like you can give Mocha, you know, like dash dash, I want it to look like this. You can, also the syntax is different, right? Like Chai has should, expect, and assert syntax, whereas maybe tape only gives you one of those, right? So there's also the way you actually write your tests. We use describe and it, right, for Mocha, but other libraries might not use the word describe. They might use the word test or test case or whatever makes sense to them, right? And so it's a matter of which one you adopt and just following their documentation. Are we feeling okay with sort of the things that I've covered? Before I adjourn, can I just do a quick recap in my notes file, if you don't mind? So we talked about modules, and I wrote down during the break, and I read this out to you, right? So now we're going to talk about testing with Mocha and Chai. Just do a quick review here. So what is Chai and what is Mocha? Because they are not the same library. So somebody help me define what Chai helps us do. First, let's forget about Mocha. We first just looked at Chai. What does Chai help us do? Yeah, gives us functions to assert expectations. I assert that this is equal to this, or I assert that this is greater than this, right? If an assertion fails, Chai's functions throw errors.
So it throws an error at the first fail it finds, right? Not all.
Yeah, on the first fail. Although we noticed that with Mocha, I had one assertion failing, and it still said that 2 ran, 1 passed, and 1 failed. So Mocha is doing some magic behind the scenes in our it functions, right? Here, it's not like the whole program, like if this fails, the whole program doesn't just terminate. Mocha actually absorbs that error and gives us that red output. So it's doing that extra legwork that we don't have to do, right? Now, if there was an assertion here and an assertion here, and the second one failed, there's no. Once one assertion fails in here, this test is considered a failure. So that's what the difference between a test and an assertion is. A test could be a collection of assertions, but you're testing a particular scenario, and that may require 3 different assertions to make sure that everything is right in that scenario. Right? But as soon as that assertion fails, this scenario has failed. This test case has failed. But this one still needs to run. I still want to know, of the 100 things, how many failures do I have? Is it just 1 or is it 100? Or something in between? So coming back to our notes, Chai gives us functions to assert expectations. If an assertion fails, Chai's functions throw errors. If any assertion, if an assertion fails, if an assertion function fails, it throws an error. And since it throws an error, it doesn't continue, right? And we'll talk about errors separately. That's a whole separate topic. But just take it for what it is. When an error happens, you've seen it, right? You've encountered more errors than successes so far. And when that happens, the program stops running, right? You don't see your future console log statements. Now, what about Mocha? Yeah, helps us. It's a test running framework to help us organize and manage our various test cases. Each test case, it's an it, right, can be organized in different groups. They're called describes, right? It's using kind of a odd syntax that for some reason is very popular amongst test frameworks. Describe and it. You'll find it in other libraries as well. So it helps us with nicer output and managing errors thrown by our assertion library. So it gives us a nice report at the end, right? And it's nicely colored. If we just see green checks, thank you, Mocha. Right? And because it's a test running framework, it has its own runner, right? We had to go into Mocha's directory and run bin Mocha to run that file. Right? So are we good with this so far? Good review? Somebody tell me what is the node modules directory so we can complete these notes. What's that for?
It's a directory for your modules that are not going to be uploaded to the kit.
Yep. Most NPM modules have dependencies. These are installed by NPM into this subfolder. since you generally have quite a few dependencies for your app, this becomes quite big. So typically, this file is git ignored and not checked in to GitHub or to your repo. But that's a problem, right? Like, that's all my dependencies. So if I'm not including them, when I clone this project later, I'm not going to have that code. Well, that's okay because we have package JSON and package lock JSON, which together, well, specifically this one, define what to reinstall into node modules. So if I go ahead right now and completely destroy my node modules folder, right, gone. As though I've just cloned this project for the first time and this file is git ignored, so it's not there, right? I no longer have that. All I have is these files and my test file. Well, now when I run npm test, it's going to be like, I can't find node modules Mocha, right? If I try to run my node color thing, it's going to be like, well, actually, that seemed to work. Why did that work? I guess colors is installed globally. Okay, let's try. Let's try just person test node test person test. It's going to complain that chai is not installed, right? Because chai is installed locally. And so I have to run npm install and not give it any names, and it will just go through my package lock file and say, these are the things that you need. Let me go ahead and get them for you. And now all of a sudden, I have my node modules folder all ready to go. Thanks to that manifest file that has everything, every single dependency that I need and its specific versions. So this flat file here, this text file with the JavaScript object in it, is a manifest of everything that ought to be in my node modules folder. And so I don't need my node modules folder because at any time, as long as I have an internet connection, I can recreate that node modules folder. Now, if I'm going on a flight, and I do this, if I'm on a flight from Vancouver to Toronto for 5 hours, and I don't plan to pay for the Wi-Fi, I want to make sure that my project doesn't need to run npm install, and I've got everything working locally, right? So that I can code on the plane. So obviously, requires to download from the internet, and so you want to be prepared for that, right? So which together define what to reinstall into node modules if when we run npm install in our project folder. Right? Whoa. Lots of stuff happening. Scary. Okay, we'll leave it there. I'll send out these notes a little bit, clean them up and send them out. But hopefully this wasn't too exhausting and we were able to follow along most of it. Most of you, not all of you. Well, that's what the rest of the day is for. If this didn't resonate, hopefully the assignments will. Cheers, enjoy, and happy Friday. Yeah, I should mention actually, sorry, that these you should not edit your lock file. So you do not go in here and ever edit your lock file. But your package JSON file, you could edit, right? You could say, I want to also have this other thing. I want this version. But to be honest, the way you do that is by running npm install and then the name of the package, right? When you do that, it automatically adds that to the JSON file, right? So if I say npm install, I don't know, some other package name, it will automatically modify my package file. And it will automatically modify my lock file. And it will also install it into my node modules folder, which we saw. So it does everything for us, right? npm install is a nice little utility to do that for us, but we could go in and manually update this. If we manually update this file, though, we still have to run npm install, so it reads the file and downloads the code, right? So it depends on your workflow, but most people just run npm install file name or a project name. Yes, and then you have to go ahead. Just because you've installed it doesn't mean that you can start. You have to still require it in your actual code wherever you need it, right?
We didn't install it, but we require it
In the code? No. So the question is, will Require automatically go ahead and install anything? No. It's going to just look for that file folder in Node Modules directory. So you have to do all your install, make sure the Node Modules directory is ready. If it's not there or that subfolder isn't there, this will fail.
And then you have to run npm install.
Exactly.
It takes that your require.
No, npm install does not look at this. npm install looks at only these two files. So it has to be in package.json. That's a good point in clarification. npm install looks at this, as well as your package lock, to together figure out, and also what's already downloaded, to figure out what needs to be downloaded still. Does that more clarify? So I think I should write that down. That's a really good point. So npm install command looks at package.json, package log.json, and what's already downloaded in Node Modules to determine what else needs to be downloaded, if anything. It does not look at your code to see what you require. Right? It's a good, important clarification. Right? Require can only be successful if the given module is already in your local project, downloaded. Right? Okay, thanks for that clarification. We'll leave it there, and I'll send these notes out in a little bit more polished manner in the next, let's say, 15 minutes. Okay, cheers, everybody.